So, hello everybody, welcome to the Royal Society. I have a couple of pieces of housekeeping. There's no fire alarm planned today, so if you hear the fire alarm, please vacate the building, assemble at the top of the steps just to your right-hand side. The second piece of housekeeping I have for you is that there is a present for all of you. The present is located underneath your seats, and I'm afraid it is in the form of a form. If you could complete these feedback forms and give them to us, that would be incredibly helpful for us in developing these events in the future. Okay, so the event this evening, Why We Write. It's been organised by the Library and Archives team here at the Royal Society, and the project which I work for, which is the Constructing Scientific Communities project. Its full title, Citizen Science in the 19th and the 21st Centuries. We're an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project, and we're run across the universities of Oxford and Leicester, and the Natural History Museum, the Royal College of Surgeons, and the Royal Society here in London. So what we're interested in as a project is scientific participation and communication. Who does science? How do they do science? And how do they talk and communicate about the science that they're doing? And we're interested in those subjects historically in the 19th century, when great hordes of people would go out into the countryside in pursuit of rational recreation and natural history to study the world around them. And we're also interested in those subjects of participation and communication in the 21st century, and in relation to our sixth project partner, the Zooniverse, which is an online platform which allows scientists to collaborate with larger groups of citizens in what's been called citizen science. So, tonight's event is really an attempt to get at this issue of communication and participation. Who writes about science and how do they write about science? And looking back across history, it's obvious that scientists write for many reasons and in many ways. They write scientific papers, they write books, but they also write diaries, plays, novels, and slogans. If I had known, I should have been a watchmaker, is Einstein's particularly famous slogan. So in a second, what we're going to do is ask a panel of historians of science to join us on the stage here, each of them representing a particular notable scientist from the past, and speak about how those scientists wrote and communicated science. But first, we've got something of a treat for you. So we've asked someone who is both a scientist and a novelist to speak to us about writing in these different modes and in different ways. So we've asked Professor Sunetra Gupta from the University of Oxford to join us tonight. Now, Professor Gupta is quite unique in being both a theoretical epidemiologist of great repute and standing, based at Oxford University's Zoology Department, and an accomplished novelist. So her most recent work, So Good in Black from 2011, is just really the last in quite a long run line of novels, stretching back through The Glass Blower's Breath, her first, Memories of Rain, Moonlight into Marzipan in 1995, A Sin of Colour in 1999, and then a plethora of other materials which sit around these novels, essays, translations, and short stories, all of which you can find from Sunetra's website, sunetragupta.com. So really she is exactly the person who we wanted to speak tonight about how to write both in a scientific mode and in a literary mode. So I'm going to ask Sunetra to join us on stage to speak to how and why she writes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Beres and Sally, for this unique opportunity. I'm very, and for the very flattering introduction. So, I'll try in 20 minutes to talk a little bit from a very personal point of view about how I write and why I write, but hopefully that will open up all sorts of questions. So some years ago, I started to write a book on the connections between science and literature. And this was a project that was proposed to me by Princeton University Press, and one that I very eagerly agreed to, because up to that point, I had just kind of done both of these things without giving much thought to why, or how, indeed. So my plan was to approach this very much from the point of view of a practitioner, as I was and remain no expert in this field. So I gave myself a sort of out by saying, okay, I'm not good. This is not going to be an academic book. I'm not going to be able to. I'm not an expert here, but I simply do these things, and I'll just tell you how and why I do them. So I thought the best way forward would be indeed to contrast the two ways in which I write literature and scientific prose, and indeed also other non-fiction essays. And in fact, here I did have a rich theme to mine, just because, in my case at least, there happens to be quite a huge difference between the two practices. And I thought I might start by illustrating the contrast. So here, and well, in fact, you probably can't read it, it doesn't matter, and I'm not going to read it out loud, is the abstract of a paper that we currently have under review, which has to do with the evolution of bacterial populations. And in it, I do what most scientists do, which is essentially to tell you exactly what I think is going on and then proceed to justify the conclusions or my inferences using a set of experiments. And each element of it is very clearly, I hope, articulated in the abstract and hopefully in the paper as well. Now, if I contrast this with the opening lines of my most recent novel, my last novel, So Good in Black, you will be immediately able to see the change in style. So I will, from this, just read the first few lines. So this is how this book starts. Child on the seashore, I loved your mother once. How unkindly these words pound through my blood as I walk down this dry path towards you. How cruelly they beat their rhythm within me, as though already relentlessly rehearsed. Now you can see here that there are obvious differences in the use at various levels, in the use of the word, the syntax, grammar, the construction of sentences. Essentially, when I'm writing a scientific article, I take great pleasure in choosing the words so that the gap between the word itself and what it's referring to is minimized. I want as unambiguous as possible a relationship between the terms of my prose, the words that I'm using, and what they refer to. Whereas when I'm writing fiction, it's really the gap between the word and its referent where a lot of the energy lies. That's the space that I'm trying to mine. And then when it comes to grammar, the rules for me are very different when I'm writing fiction as opposed to when I'm writing an essay, or particularly when I'm writing scientific prose. And I came to realize as I was writing this book that actually my relationship to grammar when I'm writing fiction is really quite visceral. So there are certain figures of speech or punctuation marks that I just can't bring myself to use. I cannot use a semicolon when I'm writing fiction. And this is just it's really a visceral reaction, and there's no rational justification of it. For example, Virginia Woolf uses a semicolon very liberally, and I love Virginia Woolf's writing, so it's not a simple reaction, it's a complex reaction, but I find no place for it in my fiction, whereas I do use it quite a lot when I'm writing scientific prose, just because I think it's a nice way of connecting different ideas. So, as I said, there are different routes, there are very different ways in which my writing progresses, and these have emerged, essentially, when it comes to particularly fiction. When it's scientific writing, I'm obviously following a set of rules and guidelines, maybe altering it in particular ways. But when it comes to fiction, it is really something that's emerged very much, this particular style of writing. So one place, though, that the two do meet, though, is in, and this is again something that emerged while writing this book for me as a revelation, is in the construction of narrative. In both cases, for me, this consists of building a whole out of disparate parts. And it is a magical moment when they do come together, whether it's, again, in composing a scientific piece, coming up with an argument, finding out, proposing a new way that bacterial populations evolve, or whether it's to putting together the narrative of a book. And one of the important elements, a collision that occurs in both cases, is the decision, or a decision that has to be made, is between how much does one show and how much does one tell. And the proportions of these do tend to vary between the exercises. In scientific writing, there is a lot more of the telling, whereas the writing of fiction, I tend to usually construct my interiors, lay out the furniture in a way that is less an act of diegesis. It's much more an act of mimesis, in that I create, I try and mimic in some ways certain scenes or certain elements. So I've been working on this book a good long time now, and in recent years, well, maybe since I turned 50, I've actually decided that this book that I'm writing on connections between science and literature, should take the form of a memoir. So rather than just putting together my thoughts, in some random way, I'm going to give myself even more liberty in writing this book. Indeed, because it's taken so long to write this, and because it's been interrupted, it has become a sort of what you'd call a commonplace book, this whole exercise. But I'm going to liberate myself even further by turning it into a memoir. And I'm curious to see, and having had a day of listening to these excellent talks on scientific diaries, I'm curious to see how these processes of whether I show or tell, and what kind of grammar I use, and how I construct sentences, is going to come into this particular space. So that's all I'm going to say about how I write. Let's just turn very quickly to why I write. Well, if I really were to go into why I write, it would take a very long time. So what I'm going to do instead is just talk about, turn to George Orwell and go back to his essay from 1946 on why he thinks people write. I've just been reading Deborah Levy's wonderful little book, Things I Don't Want to Know, which is a response to George Orwell's essay. And she uses it very cleverly as a framework for some brief and breathtakingly beautiful autobiographical sketches. So she's used it as a framework of a sort of memoir. But I thought it might be useful to put up his four sort of criteria, which he posits. Well, this is what Orwell says. He says, putting aside the need to earn a living, I think there are four great motives for writing, at any rate for writing prose. They exist in differing degrees in every writer. And any one writer, the proportions will vary from time to time, according to the atmosphere in which he is living. And these are sheer egoism, aesthetic enthusiasm, historical impulse, and political purpose. Now, for me, sheer egoism was possibly a propelling force in the first instance. I remember, certainly when I was writing my first novel, wanting to write, sort of having a deliberate purpose of wanting to write something very different to the typical sort of post-colonial novel. And I certainly also remember standing in the Royal Society, wanting to be noticed 30 years ago as a young scientist. But I must confess that I don't think is any longer a ruling force, and the various defeats that I've met along the way have humbled me and also made me realise that success is very secondary to what I really want to do and what I really want to achieve, which is just the space to think and read and write. So I would say perhaps for me, aesthetic enthusiasm is really the main guiding force, although political purpose is closely intertwined with it. And historical impulse, I think, is actually just part of aesthetic enthusiasm and political purpose. So in terms of constructing why I write, I think I would point to aesthetic enthusiasm, but I think that aesthetic enthusiasm arises from a political purpose, and the political purpose is embedded, I feel, in these decisions about how to use the word, how to use the sentence, how to use grammar, how to break the rules, which rules to break and which rules to keep. So I'd like to end with an image in which this is from a small whitewashed cell beneath the church in Florence, whose name I forget already. And it's a cell in which Michelangelo hid from the Medicis for about 3 months. And in the 3 months that he spent there, he covered the wall with charcoal drawings. That's not very surprising, I suspect. But what's interesting is what he drew. He drew, or rather, redrew, many of the works that he had already executed. So there he was, redrawing the past. He wasn't creating new paintings. There he was in this cell, and he was redrawing things that he had already drawn. And it seemed to me that this was sort of the ultimate act of creating a memoir, which is this act of redrawing. And I think this is what unites literature, science, and memoir, and alerts us to its endless aesthetic and political possibilities. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you ever so much, Sunetra, for a wonderfully personal set of reflections on writing. If I could be so bold as to put a semicolon on the end of your talk there, I'm going to ask our historians of science to come and join us up on the panel. So, we have a crew of historians of science for you, who are going to pick up on some of these reflections about purposes and ways of writing, and ventriloquize to some extent the responses of their historical actors. So, running the table this way, we have Dr. Felicity Henderson, who's joining us from Exeter, and will be representing see how this is going to go. Michael Hunter has Boyle, Anne-Marie Roos has Petiver, Edwin Rose has Banks and Solander, two to take on there. Hannah Wills has Blagden, and Roland Jackson has Tyndall. So, we've been incredibly unfair to our panellists tonight, and we're going to give them just a few minutes each, 4, 5 at the absolute maximum, to speak about their historical characters and how they wrote.
Thanks, Beres. So I'm here on behalf of Robert Hooke, who is a Fellow of the Royal Society and the curator of their museum, their collection of artefacts in the 17th century. And I guess I'm here because I'm editing Hooke's diary. He kept a very interesting, very detailed diary during the most productive part of his scientific life, and so I'm producing a new edition of this for Oxford University Press. So I'd like to say just a little bit about the difference between Hooke's scientific writing and his diary writing, because I think that picks up on what Sunetra was talking about very interestingly just then. So in the period that I study, we have to remember that there's not really a scientific style as such, because science hasn't really been invented at this period. People are still in the process of trying to work out what science is and how they're going to go about doing it. And so Hooke is part of the process of deciding how people are going to communicate the scientific discoveries and ideas that they're having. And his great work, Micrographia, which you might have seen pictures of, explores the microscopic world that he's presenting to people for the first time. And he's doing that both by using incredibly detailed engravings of the flea and the louse and the microscopic objects he's looking at, but he's also doing it with his text as well. And I think the text is really interesting because he's not writing about these things in a way that we would consider to be particularly scientific. He uses lots of metaphors. He talks about the beauty of the things that he's seeing. One example is that he looks at the silverfish, and he's looking at the way that the scales of the silverfish reflect the light and make a sort of pearly colour on the silverfish's scales. And so he explains this to his readers, but then he says that the silverfish is one of the teeth of time, because he sees it eating his books in his library, and so it's like time is destroying the books that he has. And so that's a very, I think, poetic description of something that could be simply described in a much more scientific way. And to move on to the diary that he kept, he actually called it his memoranda. So he was really keeping a record of the things that he wanted to remember that were not so much part of his scientific life, but were part of his much wider experience of living in London in the 17th century. So he was also helping to rebuild London after the Great Fire, and did a lot of work just going around viewing houses, talking to people about their rebuilding projects, taking payments, and arbitrating between disputes, that kind of thing. So he's recording all this kind of thing, and I think the diary as a document is actually a kind of index of his life, bringing his life together, bringing the scientific aspects together with the other aspects of his life, and acting as a kind of way that he can remember what it is that he's been doing, and put together all the different parts of his life, because he's connecting up the work that he's doing in the City of London, along with the work that he's doing for the Royal Society, which has been recorded elsewhere. So he's kind of using his diary as a way of connecting up the disparate parts of his life. So I'll stop there because I've been told to only speak.
So one Robert is the next Robert.
And of course they're connected because Hooke was in a sense a protege of Boyle, for whom he worked as a laboratory assistant and helped him design equipment, etc. So they're exact contemporaries and very close like that. Boyle has been the subject of a modern scholarly treatment, which does attach considerable significance to the way in which he communicated his ideas. And this is a famous book, Leviathan and the Air Pump, published in 1984 and written by Stephen Chapin and Simon Schaffer. And one of the themes of this book is the idea that Boyle used something that Stephen Chapin came up with, the concept of literary technology to describe. Boyle's literary technology is one of the tropes of Leviathan and the Air Pump, and essentially the idea of literary technology as expounded there is to give a very detailed verbal description of the processes and operations that Boyle carried out in his laboratory so that people could visualize them for themselves. And I think there is a good deal of truth in that in Boyle's books, particularly perhaps his first scientific book, New Experiments Touching the Spring of the Air, published in 1660, he does give these very prolix descriptions of the equipment he's using, the way it works, etc., before moving on to the various experiments that he does with it and the things that he's able to show through it. So, so we have this concept of Boyle as the great literary technician, as launched by Leviathan and the Air Pump. But that has always slightly jarred with other people who have found Boyle's writing rather obscure. And I don't know if anyone in this room has tried to read a work by Boyle, but it is quite hard to work out what he's trying to say. R.S. Westphal, the great historian of science, once described Boyle as a man who was unable to bring a sentence to a satisfactory conclusion. And there is an element of truth in that. And so there's a convolution about Boyle. He also was very prone to coin neologisms and generally to make things complicated for his reader. But nevertheless, he was very keen to publish. He is widely read. He widely read not only in English but also in Latin. He took great trouble to have his works translated into other languages. And I think that he genuinely intended the convolution to help to get his message across, to illustrate the complexity of the natural world that he was trying to describe and the difficulty of many of the issues that he was addressing in his writings. And this, the complexity was well intended and to him had a purpose. One of the things that struck me in working on the documents that I talked about earlier today, his work diaries, and particularly his interviews with travellers who'd been to exotic places and collected data which seemed to him usefully to complement what he could learn from his experiments, etc., was how vivid and direct they were, in complete contrast to the convoluted style that characterises so many of his published writings. And there is a sort of tension there, which I've become preoccupied by recently, that Boyle is capable of writing in a much plainer manner, and yet he rarely does so, I mean, never does so in print, and rarely does so even in his manuscript. So there's a sort of paradox there, but I think it does nothing to make Boyle less interesting. I have no idea how long I've spoken for, but I hope that will do. Sorry.
I've been struck very much about the contrast you're seeing between the public and private self and the diary and the publication. And I think that also goes for James Petiver, who's a little bit later chronologically than Boyle and Hooke, late 17th century to 18th century. When I first encountered Petiver, I was looking at his catalogs. He was an apothecary and a botanist, and he kept vast collections of dried specimens, and he wrote a lot of catalogs. Can you imagine 600 dried specimens figured and described in a catalog? He wanted to understand the natural world, and he was right at that cusp before we got to Linnaean taxonomy. Most of the reputational material I'd read about Petiver said he was an inveterate collector, almost collective obsessive of specimens, and his collection was in a bit of a mess and was bought by Sir Hans Sloane to sort of preserve it and put it into the British Museum. And frankly, when I first started working on him, that's what I saw. He was incredibly empirical, very good at noting fine differences between specimens, and I saw him as kind of this dry figure. But then I found a diary of his when he was written as a young man quite by accident. And he was going to London. He wanted to learn about the collections there. He was coming from Kendal. He was taking this journey to meet important people, to visit the famous gardens and see botanical specimens, and his prose came alive. I found him to be humorous. He talked about, he was a self-made man, he was an apothecary, so he didn't come from wealth or stature, and he talked about going to the collection at Wollaton Hall in Nottingham for the first time, and he says, and now I have to comb my head and stroke my beard. What a magnificent collection this is, and he was overwhelmed by what he saw. He described his itinerary, everything from almost drowning in a river to being stuck in a thunderstorm at the top of Ingleborough Peak and going to a Moorish house, which just turned out to be a house on the moors. I was very disappointed about that. I thought it was going to be something much more exotic than that. And all of a sudden, I saw him as a person. He came alive for me, and I realized that his catalogs that he was making was an attempt to establish his fame, to establish his reputation as a botanist, as a famous apothecary, and that while that was important, and that's what we remember him by, it only was a sliver of what the diary revealed about his character, a warm, funny, observant man who was trying to make his way in the world.
So, yes, Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander. So I'm going to start, actually, just briefly mentioning who Daniel Solander was, because I think he's probably somebody not too many people have actually heard of. Solander was a student of Carl Linnaeus, and Linnaeus developed the system of hierarchic taxonomy, which enabled people to ascribe a unique binomial name to a particular species, which is in essence, that is still the same system particularly used in botany today. Solander came to Bristol in 1763, in 1762, and he got a job at the British Museum in 1763 in order to reclassify the natural historical collections which had been organised according to a much earlier system. And Solander really was somebody who reflects the development of Linnaean systematics in Britain at that time. Now, in the 1760s, he came across a young Joseph Banks. Now, Banks was incredibly intelligent and enthusiastic about botany, and eventually this culminated into a Royal Society expedition in 1768, known more commonly as the Endeavour voyage, led by Captain James Hooke. Now, the main purposes of this exhibition were to first observe the transept of Venus in the South Seas in Tahiti, and secondly, to discover the great unknown southern continent. Now, upon this voyage, Banks kept a diary, or a journal. It's known as the Endeavour Journal, which really records the day-to-day events, but it also records what he was interested in natural history. And he includes large systematic lists within this journal. And what I'm very interested in is how this journal connects to his more detailed scientific work. For instance, Banks had several interleaved copies of Linnaeus. Upon this voyage, they collected over 30,000 plants, over 1,500 of which were completely new species unknown to European naturalists. And what he did was, in these works, which were effectively systematic lists of plants, he had his secretary add to them. And this is also reflected in the journal and in Solander's work. Solander was the main person behind this. Solander knew the Linnaean system like the back of his hand, and helped Banks, and they worked together along with Hooke, whose work is also reflected in this journal. But something that really surprises me about Banks's journal is it's, as well as being scientific, it reflects the day-to-day events. For instance, he gave the governor of Madeira repeated electric shocks because he interrupted his botanising. Another time he describes how the first day in Botany Bay, how they had spears thrown at them by the local inhabitants. I think they retreated the ship quite quickly after that instance. But what this journal has been looked at previously by scholars is really just as an account of things that's going on. No one's really associated it with the scientific work that was going on. And this scientific work is really what founded Banks's fame upon their return. They returned to Deal in 1771, very late. Most people thought the ship had been lost. It had disappeared from the newspapers a few months before. There's no hope. But it was a great celebration. It wasn't Hooke, the great navigator, who was celebrated upon the return. It was Banks and Solander. Banks and Solander visited the king, for example. And that really solidified Banks's fame in institutions such as the Royal Society. And Banks then later became president of the Royal Society in 1778, a position that he held until 1820.
Thanks. So Blagden follows on quite nicely here, so I'll just introduce who Charles Blagden was. He was secretary to the Royal Society from 1784 until 1797, so this is directly under the presidency of Joseph Banks. Now, he first trained as a doctor at Edinburgh University, but he's not really known particularly as a physician. He's more known as a great administrator of science, so for his work as secretary to the Royal Society and also as a personal assistant to Henry Cavendish. Now, he's also what historians describe as a great go-between. So this is someone that's really interested in kind of sharing information with all different kinds of communities, different kinds of people. So these would be his friends in London that he would share news with, and also his friends on the continent, particularly people in Paris. Now, this kind of news would be all kinds of things. It might be political news to do with at home or abroad. It might also be scientific discoveries, so perhaps the latest paper read at the Royal Society or something that someone's recently discovered. It would even be gossip, so what his friends were up to that they didn't want other people to know. He'd also share that. Whether or not they wanted him to is another thing. So when thinking about Blagden's diary, I think it's easiest to begin with thinking about what it's not. So it's perhaps not a diary in your conventional sense, in that it's not really got kind of personal reflections. It's not really an interior monologue. It's not really what Blagden's thinking. I think it's a lot more like an itinerary, so I can talk you through a typical entry in the diary. It always begins with the date, and then what follows is a list of all the places that Blagden went. So these will be friends' houses, might be a trip to the Royal Society, might mention that he dined out at a particular club. But what comes in between these sort of big markers of where he's been in his day will only be very, very brief notes, so it might be a rough kind of topic of conversation, but really there's not very much detail at all. His prose is quite terse and it's quite dry when you come to read it. And I think this is quite related to why Blagden kept his diary. I would argue that Blagden's diary was used as an aid memoir, so it's something that he would refer back to on later days if he wanted to remember what he'd been up to on the day previously. And this is something really important when we think about Blagden's role as a go-between, so someone that's sharing information. Blagden met lots of people. He got sort of lots of different news from lots of different sources, and it was important for him to have somewhere to write down all this in sort of rough notes that he could later refer to. So if you look at Blagden's letters, you can often find him referring to specific diary entries and elaborating on things that he's put in his diary. And as a historian, this is something that's really useful. When you're dealing with quite a dry diary entry, it can be helpful to compare the diary with letters, which gives you a lot more context and detail. So if we're thinking sort of about genre and about style of writing, I would say that Blagden's diary is very much factual. It's just a bare account of what he did in his day. There's hardly any sort of personal reflection. It's very, very much just the facts of the day, something that he would refer to later when he wanted to compose other things like letters to his friends.
And finally to John Tyndall. We move into the 19th century. Tyndall, born roughly 1822, died 1893, physicist, probably best known for his discovery of the absorption of heat by gases in the atmosphere underpinning our understanding of meteorology and climate change. First to give a decent explanation of why the sky is blue, much other work. And coming more towards your area, etc., he wrote publicly about science and he wrote privately. So in public, apart from a lot of magazine articles, he wrote many books for popular consumption on subjects like heat, sound and light, so not novels. Books on mountaineering, a couple of books on mountaineering, and publications, public books of collections of his papers. Why did he do all this? I think partly for the money. He earned, over a particular period of his career, about as much, £1,000 a year, multiply that by about 100, £1,000 a year from his books, which is roughly the same as he earned from all his employed income over many years. He wrote, I think, many books because of a drive to educate the public in science. It was an early sort of science education, science communication. He says that in his letters and journals. He wrote to get his work on a scientific record, so those collations of his papers, which would otherwise just be seen by scientists, go out a little bit more publicly. And he wrote his sort of mountaineering books, partly because I think they were quite good reads, and partly to project an image of this manly mountaineer striding around the peaks of the Alps. He also, of course, wrote scientific papers. They're very different from yours still. We haven't, although we're moving from the sort of Hooke's period, they're still quite narrative. They're not in anything like the form you'd expect of a modern paper. In private, he wrote a whole range of journals, and they contain mostly descriptions of what he did and who he met, a bit of self-examination, some chastising, self-chastising, he's not working hard enough. They contain drafts of significant letters, poems, comments on individuals, people like Thomas Carlyle and Tennyson, who are friends of his, They contain some of his philosophy and metaphysics, which actually you can then trace into his public pronouncements. And they contain some nice snippets on his emotional entanglements. Some pages are torn out, and I suspect some of those relate to some of those emotional entanglements. And why did he keep those private journals? I think partly it was because it was a common practice at the time. Some of them were shared with very intimate friends. I think they helped him to keep to resolutions, to his self-discipline, and partly as an aid to memory. And I think later on he became tempted by the idea of writing an autobiography, for which, of course, they would have been useful. And for me, because I'm writing a biography of him, I must say they are extremely useful.
So please join me in thanking our panelists. It's worth saying I've pulled off the amazing feat of 300 years of history of science in 20 minutes, from natural philosophy through to science. So we'd like to throw it open to the audience to you for some questions for either our panelists or for Sunetra.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It was wonderful. Sunetra, I wanted to follow up what you were saying about narrative and how it pulled together the literature and your science work. Is it, because the science writing you were showing us did not have much narrative, and I was wondering whether you were meaning that actually in your thinking through a scientific theory and a hypothesis, that you actually draw on your understanding of narrative from the literary side? Or is that pushing it a bit too far?
So this is a slide I skipped, and this is an analogy that, or an object I use to explain exactly what I do mean and where the two processes do come together. So I think a scientific narrative is constructed out of the facts. I mean, I think that is the joy of doing science for me, is that you have these different facts and then putting them together, which I typically do using a mathematical model, so using mathematics as a language, is for me an act of essentially creating a narrative structure. And similarly with my novels as well, I feel like I set up scenes and characters and eventually it all gets pulled together into this narrative. And the reason this object, which is known as a perspective box, seems to me a very good metaphor for this, is that a perspective box, these are objects that were created in the, I think, 17th century, 16th, I can't remember, when the Dutch were fascinated with perspective, and this is created by Samuel von Hooke, and you can see it in the National Gallery not very far away. And what you'd see is a box which is painted on 5 sides, and if you look at it from the one side which isn't painted, you see different scenes, but they are all out of proportion. I mean, they don't fit together in any way. But on the sides of the box are 2 peepholes. So the other name for this is the Dutch peep show, which I quite like. And it's when you peep through those holes that it all fits together, that it all comes together into one whole. And I think that the sort of mimesis diegesis duality kind of is reflected in this, in that it's the drilling of the hole that is directing the eye, that is creating the narrative out of parts that don't necessarily at first seem to fit together. And that's exactly how I feel that's what I feel I am doing when I put together a scientific argument, which is usually a new idea about how something works. And it's certainly also how I feel when I've got to that point in writing a novel where it all suddenly takes shape. So that's where I think they connect.
Hello, thank you very much. I was just wondering, this is a question for the whole panel in general, but do you think that the diaries written by scientists of the past would differ from personal diaries written by modern day scientists, and why?
Well, in terms of Hooke, no, I don't think it would very, very much. But partly because of what I was saying, that he was not talking so much about his scientific work. So you really get a great sense of him as an individual sort of living his life in London. And I think you probably would get a similar kind of experience if you were reading a diary that was written today.
I think that's right. So, scientists are people. I mean, people write diaries, some of whom are scientists. And again, for somebody like Tyndall, whose journal-type diary is very much a general description of what he was doing, what he was thinking, how he was thinking, with some science in there, in a sort of narrative form, but in many cases not. It's just one person's record of, idiosyncratic record of what they wanted to note down. So I don't think it was affected particularly by the fact that he was a scientist.
I mean, one thing that's come out of the discussion we've had earlier today is that is how unscientific most of these diaries are, how similar scientist diaries are to everyone else's diaries. And one of the strange things really that comes out about diary writing, which no one was really able to answer today, is how people learn to write diaries. I mean, it's almost as if people learn by kind of osmosis how to write a diary, and everyone learns it for themselves separately. And to that extent, I think Felicity is right. I mean, I think that if you go and look at a 17th century diary, it is surprisingly similar to the kind of diary you might still write in the 21st, because it's almost as if a diary sort of almost takes a form of its own. So.
I can tell you what I do. And I have various different kinds of diaries. I actually last year picked up one which has a space for 5 consecutive years the same day, but it's a very short space. So that I think I'm conducting very much in the Blagden way. But I also have some books where I just write. I have 2 daughters, and I have 2 books where I sometimes just sit and write to them. So to record something that they might read, maybe. Probably won't ever, but anyway. So I do that too. And certainly when I was younger anyway, I had very much the kind of diary where I would pour out my emotional stuff. And actually, Sally, you were asking about, do I have a sort of workbook? And I don't anymore because because you can keep the sorts of things you'd keep in your workbook on as figures or results of experiments on your computer, which is what I do. So I think, yes, I would agree that nothing's changed. It's just, and that what's wonderful is you've all illustrated various reasons why people would choose one practice over the other. And they probably all did all sorts of different things. We just don't have all of it.
I think this is interesting about the difference between the written diary and keeping things on the computer, but I think there are analogies with Petiver. He headed his diary with a very fancy Latin term because he was showing off that he knew Latin as an apothecary. And when I look at that, I thought, yeah, and if you were in the 21st century, you would be putting something up on Facebook, showing this is what I've accomplished and look how great I am and here's my travel log. I mean, so they're in sometimes when you read these diaries, you see the attempt of the individual to self-fashion. Even though he said he only wrote his diary to show to a few friends, I think he was somewhat aware of the fact that when he was going to London to meet with people like Richard Baxter or John Woodward or other famous naturalists, that he was participating in something of note. He seemed to have a sense of what he was about, and he's constructing his diary towards that sense. And so in some parts of it are very much in that Facebook mode, but then there's these other areas where his rather humble origins come forth, and his sense of down to earth, very down to earth. He was very excited, for instance, of seeing the relics of Guy of Warwick and wanted to see his great shield and mighty sword and wondered if the legends were true. So you get this really interesting mixture of personality come forth, and then that's interspersed with botanical observations. So it's a very idiosyncratic portrait, but a wonderful one.
What is reflected in Banks's journal is his great ambition in 1768. Banks described how many nobles and wealthy people, gentry such as himself, went on the European Grand Tour and visited places like Rome to see the ruins of the ancients, the Athens, etc. Banks described himself as outdoing all of them. I am going to do the world tour, to paraphrase, and he did. But Banks's diary is very interesting because linking it to modern diaries of taxonomists, and I know a few of them who work in the Natural History Museum. It's very interesting how they also, in these diaries, they do go along, like Banks does, list what happens in the day and then the plants, and that will link to something else. But then there's the contextualization of where they find these new species, which is also very important for science, because if you have a specimen and you don't know where it came from, under what circumstances, it's actually quite worthless. So I think Banks's diary is very interesting because it reflects his ambition, but it also it's a very interesting thing because it links his scientific work to the day-to-day settings, which complement each other wonderfully for giving these things an increased scientific value. And I must say, all of the specimens that he collected, plant-wise, are still in the General Herbarium in the Natural History Museum and are still used on a frequent basis.
I would say, I think sometimes it's helpful to think about Blagden's diary more as sort of like if you keep a calendar yourself, so like, or a little diary where you write down all your appointments and engagements, because I think that's kind of really what is going on in his diary. So in that sense, I think it would be very similar to Day. Although actually, there are a few times where Blagden kind of breaks out of this itinerary and you get sort of comments about the behaviour of his friends. So Blagden worked very closely with Henry Cavendish, and when they have a row or like Blagden's a bit upset by something Cavendish has said, he'll write, oh, Cavendish was horrible, a bit sulky. So you kind of get the sense that only when he's angry kind of personal details come out. And I like that because when I read it, I feel it's quite universal. We all have days where we're annoyed with something that someone's done. You might make a note of it because like you might send a text to someone, you might record it somehow, your kind of feelings. So yeah, I think Blagden's diary, like I could see myself even doing something similar today with sort of like keeping a record of where I've been, and then also those kind of funny comments that we all make when we're sort of annoyed with the behaviour of someone else, really.
Okay, so we've got one question there, and then the lady, gentleman's wearing the red top, and another one over there.
Methodologically speaking, how do you approach your research using diaries, assuming there is a large quantity, years and years worth of entries, some of which I'm sure is quite interesting and some of which I imagine is quite dull and ordinary. How do you sort through all of that in a productive manner?
Read, and have a massive spreadsheet.
It's good to know.
Well, I would say with Blagden's diary, it's really, really hard to read because the handwriting is just absolutely terrible. It's the worst that the Royal Society probably has. So one of the things that I find when approaching the diary is that you really have to kind of transcribing it is really the only way of reading it because it's just too difficult to read otherwise. So the way that I've gone about it is that I've sort of read around Blagden's life and the work that he did with Banks, found a year that I think is kind of potentially interesting. So I've chosen 1795 just because they're both kind of doing interesting work with the government and that sort of thing. And I'm just literally going through and transcribing the whole year. And you're right, lots of it is kind of like a bit mundane, but there's always interesting things to say. There's always kind of a connection with someone that you didn't realise that, oh, Blagden knew that person. So yeah, I would say with difficult handwriting, you've got to maybe kind of hone in and just sit down and transcribe, even though some of it will be useful and then some maybe not so much.
Banks's journal obviously only lasted for a few years, between 1768 and 1771, but I mean he did consistently keep records of what he was doing throughout his lifetime. There's a great document, not just written by him, but his hand does appear in it, called the Day Book of the Herbarium, because when he arrived back, his house and this collection became the pinnacle of natural historical knowledge, really, throughout his lifetime. And you can see how he occasionally records things. There's also a very interesting document written by Banks where there's a bit of a joke, I think, where he records everybody's weight who steps through the front door. But this particular journal, the writing, etc., is very, very clear. And that is because it had so many links to the rest of his scientific work, and his scientific staff had to be able to read it in order to get the information from it. So I hope that sort of clarifies things slightly more on that note.
Petiver wrote this as just because he did something of what he was very proud of. He wanted to show it to his friends. The handwriting is clear, but for me, when I read it, I wanted to reconstruct where he made his field expeditions, what types of specimens he found, speculate why he talked to particular people. And to do that, I had to connect the diary to a variety of his correspondence, to catalogs, to sketches that he made. I was trying to really, by using a variety of sources, recreate what I called the confabulatory life of the scholar. I'm trying to understand in my head what were those personal conversations that different naturalists had with each other when they were trying to puzzle out a problem, and see if I could almost create a speaking picture of what transpired on his journey, and this very, very early example of a proto-field expedition.
To answer the question, I think trying to give an overall characterization of a diary is incredibly difficult. And in fact, I think it's equally difficult to sort of compare and contrast diaries. Many, many years ago, I thought I might even try to write a study of diaries and try to, categorize them and draw conclusions about how they differed and why. And I'm afraid I just gave up. And that's an experience that I shared with another eminent historian of diaries, William Matthews, who was the co-editor of Pepys's diary with Robert Latham, who actually states, I think in the introduction to the Pepys diary, that it's impossible to write an account of diary writing. All you can do is to read the diaries.
I agree with Michael.
So there were two more questions that maybe we could bunch together as time is pressing for the session, and then give them both at the same time to our panelists to respond.
Mine's more for Sunetra. So on a practical level, science is kind of a full-time job. How and why? How do you find the time and energy to write fiction? Do you have a specific routine that allows you to fit that in?
Do you want to take the other question, or should I write that?
For Sunetra as well, or for the panel?
I guess it could be for Sunetra, but it's for the panel as well. For published writing rather than diaries, how different is the feeling of responsibility to the readership? Is it different at all, and how does it affect writing?
Just the logistics question. I mean, it's no, I don't have a sort of schedule or anything. I really just take it as it comes, which is why before I had children I wrote 4 novels, and then since I've had children I've published one, working on another one. But it doesn't bother me. I mean, I do these things because I want to do them, but of course being a scientist and being responsible for my students, for example, is my job, so that always comes first. And so, yes, I just fit it in as I can, which is clearly not very well. In terms of responsibility to the reader, that brings up all sorts of issues. I mean, the problem now is that there's this notion of having responsibility not so much to the reader as to the market. And I think the two are actually in opposition. So I like to think that my responsibility to the reader is where I talked about the political purpose, and it's closely bound up within the aesthetic concerns, because what I'm trying to do for myself and for the reader is to somehow empower them in some way, or enfranchise them to understand their realities, their universe, or their question, the human condition, whatever it is that actually preoccupies me, us, them. And I do find it unfortunate that that has somehow been conflated with actually pleasing the market. And I think I'm just going to use it as your question as an opportunity just to say we need to keep them very, very separate. And the
same is true for your scientific writing as well?
Yes, actually, absolutely so. I think that it's very important to not go down the route of playing the game when it comes to doing science, which is, again, something that is a problem right now.
Very quick comment, because I think workload is an issue for everybody, isn't it? And as far as Tyndall's concerned, when he published his first book, Glasses of the Alps, in 1860, he said he'd never write another one. Then published another one, Heat and Mode of Motion, in 1863, and said exactly the same thing again. but he carried on. I think that's what writers do.
Anyone else on the panel want to come in on how to find the time to write or the duty of care to your readership? In a couple of minutes.
I could try and say something about Banks. Banks attempted to publish what would probably have been one of the greatest works of botany of the late 18th century, a work called the Florilegium. This was based on every specimen, pretty much every new specimen at least, that they collected on the voyage, which is recorded in Banks's journal. They had the artist on the voyage, Sidney Parkinson, draw the specimen from life. Banks, when they returned to London, he and Solander started putting together this great work with the help of a huge, huge team. It was a team larger than the entire staff of the British Museum at the time. This took a lot of time and energy, and Banks, being president of the Royal Society by the early 1780s, as well as doing a lot of other work, it effectively left it to Solander. Now, Solander died in 1782, and this book was never printed. They had the copper plates, they have the images, we have the instructions on how to print it and the text. And it was actually, the first edition came out in the mid-1980s, which is probably about the longest sort of backlog you can imagine. But I must say, with all of this additional work, Banks and Solander obviously, and due to fairly unfortunate circumstances, obviously didn't have the time to publish. And so I can somewhat sympathise with them, but that has, unfortunately, also sealed their reputation as, in some cases, as fairly minor characters in history.
Could I just, this was another slide I had that I didn't show, just in terms of responsibility to your audience. I think this is a wonderful quote from Mark Rothko, and you'd be surprised, I'm sure, to hear that he says, "I'm not an abstract painter. I'm not interested in the relationship between form and colour. The only thing I care about is the expression of man's basic emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, destiny." So I think that's where, that crystallises for me the notion of responsibility in a very particular way.
And I think that marks a pretty fantastic place to call this evening to an end. Thank our panellists and Professor Gupta.